Where you start is the challenge, because first you have to say, what is a native plant? And that's a big issue for a lot of people. It's even people who are very interested in plants, it gets very confusing, because you can say, well, anything that grows wild without us helping it is a native plant, isn't it? But a lot of those plants that we see, actually about 1,000 out of the 3,000 that are growing in New England at this point, didn't originate here. They came from somewhere else. They came with the colonists, they came as hitchhikers on ships or whatever. Sometimes they were introduced intentionally, and a lot of them are not a problem. Some of them are problems. They become invasive because they're so aggressive in this environment. But we have so many plants which are naturalized here, but they don't actually have the same sort of relationship with the insects that our native plants do. And so they may be visited, the bees would pollinate them and things like that, but a lot of things have many insects that interact with them. And so when you're talking about non-native plants, you're talking about things that didn't evolve here, so they have a much more limited ecosystem function. But if you think of, traditionally what was native was a plant that had been here before the colonists arrived. That was sort of the traditional way of marking a line, because that was really the beginning of what I call the globalization of the plant world in this part of the world, was when the colonists, because they brought all sorts of plants with them intentionally, and because they were trying to survive in this new world. But those plants, like the dandelion, for example, they grow very happily here without any help. But they're not really native here. So the native part, you got to think of a time frame and also of a place. So what's native here in New England, what's native in northern New England actually is not necessarily the same as plants that are native in southern New England. And so there's something that we call ecoregions now, as opposed to saying, well, this plant is native to Massachusetts and this plant is native to New Hampshire, because plants don't pay any attention to the political boundaries, even though that was the way plants were traditionally categorized. It's much more useful to talk about what's native to an ecoregion, where things and are native to the eastern temperate forest, for example, or which is a huge area, most of the eastern United States, or they're native to the coastal sand plain, or they're native to I don't remember the names of the particular different ecoregions, but there's an ecoregion that goes up through the middle of the New England states in the more mountainous areas. And so things plants may be native to one or many of those ecoregions. But that's really where they fit into the environment, as opposed to just where they're hardy, which is what gardeners usually, in our part of the world at least, hardiness is the thing people first think about. They say, oh, will a plant grow here? Because if a lot of plants can't survive our winters, and obviously it's not native if it can't survive our winters, but there's a lot more to being native than just to being able to survive through our winters, of course. Only a few of them are what we would call bad, because the plants that essentially have become our invasive plants, people can use the term more precisely or more sort of loosely. Some people would say, oh, poison ivy is a terrible invasive. Well, it's very aggressive and it spreads well, but it's a native plant. So it does have that ecosystem function with the other insects and birds. Birds love the poison ivy berries, for example. And they're very important as a food source when they're migrating. But the only plants that are bad really are the ones that don't have any, because they don't have any checks on their vigor, they spread and really crowd out all of the native plants. So there are certain ones that a lot of people are familiar with. The Japanese honeysuckle is one that's been around for quite a while now. The bittersweet vine is another one that you can't help but see if you start looking, things twining up into trees. It's kind of like the kudzu of the north. And they can really smother and literally strangle trees with their wrapping around them. So those are the plants, and they tend to have a couple of characteristics that make them invasive. Besides the fact that they don't they didn't originate here. But what makes them so successful and so dangerous as with their success is they tend to have a lot of fruits, a lot of seeds that distribute widely. They tend to leaf out earlier in the spring, so they actually get a longer growing season than our native plants, and they often keep their leaves later in the fall as well. So if you look out in the woods in the early spring, you will see the Japanese barberry leafing out before almost anything else. It's a great time to go pull it because you can easily identify it. But those are the sort of things, the fact that it can spread and it can overwhelm the native plants that are around. There are a lot of plants that don't do any harm that we plant or that are around, like the Queen Anne's lace. It's not like it becomes a monoculture. That's the other thing. The invasive plants tend to really just create a blanket and smother everything else. Garlic mustard is one of the current ones that we're looking at. That's because it's biennial. It spreads really fast. It creates seeds in just 2 years. So it can move into an area that's specially disturbed soils. And again, invasives are very good at moving into in disturbed soils, like along our roadsides, and they just blanket it with their own plants, that one species, and then other things can't grow up. And some of them are really clever plants. They, like the garlic mustard, they actually have a chemical in their roots that goes into the soil which makes it inhospitable for other plants. So it makes it, they essentially have a real advantage in competition that makes it unfair, if you will. Burning bush is a great example. Burning bush was planted very widely because of the beautiful red foliage it has in the fall. Well, the problem is the birds eat the seeds, and then they scatter the seeds through the woods, and so you have it growing up everywhere. So burning bush is actually on a list that in Massachusetts it can't be sold at a nursery anymore. And then there are plants which might be, people think they're on the verge of becoming invasive, but they're not technically classified yet, and so those can still be sold. So it's really up to the consumer to be aware or try to be aware of what might be the next invasive plant. But there are really sort of two big categories. One is invasives that no one would actually plant, garlic mustard. But people planted burning bush, or they planted. Multiflora Rose was spread by the road departments because it was used as erosion control. And people said, it's great, it has lots of berries for the birds, so it's a good thing. Yes, it did feed the birds, but in the process, again, the birds spread the seeds very widely. So that became a huge problem. So that's another, Multiflora Rose is another one of our real pests. And boy, with all those thorns and the huge root systems they create, they're really hard to get rid of too. We're just now sort of coming to an understanding of how much damage we've done to our environment. Many years ago with Rachel Carson and the Silent Spring, people suddenly realized that the DDT that we were using was killing our birds because the eggshells became so thin. So that one particular little thing was something that people learned about and we addressed. We stopped using DDT, and that solved that problem. But what we haven't really come to grips with is how much all the chemicals that we use for everything out in the world, that the effects they're having, and because they're not obvious, and so it's just become a sort of huge thing that's creeping up on us a little bit at a time. Some of the interesting statistics that have come out in recent studies is that we've lost about 1/3 of our insects. Total volume, if you will, mass of insects, according to a recent study in Germany, in the past 50 years. And we've lost about 1/3 of our birds in North America in the same time. And you might sort of say, that's interesting. What's the correlation between all those insects and the birds? And it's like, actually, it's really big because birds don't survive on our bird feeders. They need insects. They are totally dependent on insects and largely caterpillars for their young. So if you don't have enough caterpillars, so if you're spraying your trees for gypsy moth or you're spraying for, one thing or another, all the caterpillars in them will die, including your gypsy moth that you're trying to get perhaps, but you'll kill everything else as well. Most poisons are not that selective. They kill anything, they're going to kill everything. And so then you have wiped out the caterpillars, that generation of caterpillars. Then the birds have nothing to feed their young. So what we're seeing is the cascade of effects. If we've killed off a third of our insects, and it's not surprising that we've lost a third of our birds. Now, that's not the one thing that's caused the birds' decline, because loss of habitat's important, and loss of their wintering grounds is important for migrating birds. There are lots of different factors, but they all contribute. And so we're really looking at, I think, a pretty major ecosystem collapse at some point in the not that distant future. And anytime that you can plant a native plant, you are providing something that will fit into and enable the ecosystem to keep functioning. If you want birds, absolutely, you want those native plants. Doug Tallamy, a great author and researcher, says if you only plant one thing, plant an oak tree, because there's something, nationwide it's like 900 different species of caterpillar, and even in this eastern part of the country, about 400 different caterpillars feed on the leaves of oak trees. Now, it's not going to really bother you with a few insects are up there eating on those leaves. You will not even know it unless you get something that's an invasive, like the gypsy moth, eats everything and really damages the trees. But for the most part, there's an equilibrium between the pests, as we call them, or the insects, and their predators. So you have to have the prey to have the predator. So they both have to keep going. And so if you plant a native plant, then something will eat on it, that something else will eat on it, that something else will eat. Insects really are the beginning of the food chain in terms of what takes plants and turns it into something that other animals, and including people, can eat. So if we wipe out the insects, then we wipe out the rest of the food chain too, because it all depends on that. And what do the insects eat? They eat the plants. And despite the fact that we have learned a lot about the non-native insects that come in and trying to control non-native plants and one thing or another, when you look at the sort of basic system of the ecology in an area, those insects want to eat the plants that they're used to. They've actually learned and made their digestive system able to eat certain kinds of plants. And so, because plants try to defend themselves, plants create chemicals so that the insects won't eat them as well. They have their own control, if you will. And if you have insects that are very closely tied to certain plants, those are the ones that essentially will live in that environment and then will be part of the greater system of the ecology. As I say, it gets pretty complicated, but fundamentally, the food chain is really what makes everything work, and plants are the bottom of the food chain. And it turns out that it's not just any plant. The native plants are the ones that will work best for the food chain that's in our area. They studied chickadees, and it took between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars to raise a single brood of chickadees of like 5 chicks. 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars. So if you don't have 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars in your yard, you won't have chickadees. It becomes that simple, and that's a point at which people can begin to relate. It's like, well, gee, I have to have these little things feeding, and they're mostly up in the trees where I'm not even going to see them. So it's not like they're eating my entire garden and leaving me, with nothing. And the problem is people need to appreciate those insects that aren't necessarily as attractive, and it's not even just the, as I say, the caterpillars are the ones that are the primary food, caterpillars and spiders for the young birds, but everything is feeding something else, and we have, of course, a lot of concern in the past few years has been for pollinators. Now, pollinators, most people think of a bee. And they look over and they say, okay, there's a honeybee, that's good. It's like, well, actually, a honeybee is not native. And so what people, we're accustomed to thinking of saving the honeybee because that's what our agriculture depends on. But they were brought in, again, with the early colonists. But we have, I think it's about 400, I'm sure I don't remember the number exactly, native bees in New England. And they are what is essentially tied to our native plants. And again, if you don't have a plant being pollinated, then you won't have seeds and you won't have the plant continue. So I think of sort of two different sides. One is the pollination. So we've got you know, some little bees. I can't identify them. Little bees on the bugbane here. Cimicifuga, it used to be called, is now Actea racemosa. And it's a great plant for insects and for bees. But we need the native bees, not just the honeybees. So that's sort of two different things. So you've got the pollination that you need, and then you've got the food web, which is the plants being eaten by insects that eat leaves. So there's sort of two different things that are both critical to the functioning of the ecosystem. But you can see these are just covered with the bees. Bees are doing two things. They're collecting nectar and they're collecting pollen. And they serve two different functions. And some bees are, you know, one is more important than the other, but all of them use pollen to feed their young. So again, pollen is the sort of the food for the juvenile stage of the bee. And there are, interestingly, even preferences that bees can a lot of our native bees can only use the pollen from certain plants to feed their young. So it's not just like any plant will do. So, you know, you think, oh, I'm helping all the bees by planting things that flower all summer long and have, well, the petunias probably aren't going to do anything, or the dahlias or whatever. They're providing nectar probably, but they're not going to be what's there for the essential part of raising the next brood of young. Honeybees are one of the generalists in the world, and there are a small number of generalists, and then there are a lot of specialists. And so we've basically forgotten that most of the world is specialists. I don't see a label on these, so I'm not sure which variety they are. Just beautiful. They're very pretty. So this is the native Rhododendron maximum, which is native all the way up, I believe, into Maine. And it's the last blooming of the evergreen rhododendrons. And the bumblebees love it. Another thing I love here in the woodland garden is the ferns, because they're something that provide texture all through the season. You know, you've got the flowers in the spring, but then the ferns really come into their own in the midsummer. A lot of fun textures. Like anything else, if you only know ferns as one category, if one, you know, think all ferns are the same, it's you're missing out a lot. There's a lot of different varieties and some very lovely textures. But the little leaf that we're seeing here is a flock Stolonifrow, which is a fabulous ground cover. Blooms in early May, sort of white or sort of lavender blue. And it's just beautiful. You can imagine this carpet of this blue. It's only about 6 inches tall. I just absolutely love the native lilies. Turks Cap Lily, they're called, for the shape. Now, the pond is always where you find lots of activity with dragonflies and turtles. There went somebody. Turtles are going up on the log here, and I see the little bitty one in front of the big one. Now, so milkweed is one of the examples that people have learned about because of the monarch butterflies, which I think is a great thing. People, as I say, people have actually become fond of an insect, even if they don't realize it's an insect. The monarch butterfly, of course, has a caterpillar stage, and like all insects, and they eat different things at different stages. And people have learned that they need to plant milkweed for the monarch butterflies. But it's not for the adults, because the adults can drink nectar from all sorts of different flowers, but it's for the caterpillar stage. They can only eat milkweed. And that's the example, as I say, of the plants having very specific relationships with different insects. And the plant needs the insect needs the plant. It's an evolved connection. And most of our insects turn out to be that kind of specialized relationship. We just don't know about them. I sort of had the assumption that most were generalists and the monarch was an exception. It turned out it's the other way around. Most are specific connections with different plants. People are beginning to ask for natives, which is really nice. Now we're getting into sort of the next level of complication, if you will. And places like the Garden in the Woods with the Native Plant Trust, they sell plants as much as possible which are not only native plants, but they come from what they call a local genotype. So they are plants whose parents, if you will, grew up, they evolved in this area. But it's wonderful now that a lot of places are telling you, because people are looking for natives. But here you get into that question of what is native. And people will say, well, anything that's native to the United States is great. It's like, well, a plant that's native to the Northwest, the Washington, Oregon area, that may actually have absolutely no interactions with the ecosystem in the East. And that's where the ecoregion concept gets to be handy, because you can say, well, yeah, that's a totally different ecoregion from the East here. And so if you are looking at a plant and it says it's native, but it's native to Washington State, it's really not that useful in New England in terms of serving the function of a native. And so if that's what you're trying to do, if you're trying to make your garden or your landscape part of the local environment for all the insects and bees, then you need to have things which are native at least to the eastern part of the country. Now, some of the things that are native to Georgia and are hardy here and are not really considered native here, but at least there's a chance that they will have an interaction because they're in the same large ecoregion as we are. Yeah, these are some of the cinnamon ferns that can get quite large along the side of the pond here. Of course, native blueberries are a wonderful plant that, we kind of forget that that's a native plant sometimes. Very important for a lot of insects feed on the leaves as well as things eating the berries like birds. If everyone took half their lawn and made it into native plants, we would have an area that's larger than all of our national parks put together. Survival of the whole planet really depends on the systems that have evolved over millennia, and that includes how plants relate to the rest of the world, being eaten and then feeding the next layer up in the food chain.